Hello, and welcome back to Crit and Crit. I am Axion,
And I'm Scint.
and welcome to Hollow Knight.
So I think rather than tell you what we're going to read, I'm just going to give you the first line of it, and you can probably guess from there.
Alright, have at it.
As Gregor Samsa awoke one morning from uneasy dreams, he found himself transformed in his bed into a gigantic insect.
And that should tell you why we're playing Hollow Knight, those who are familiar with the game.
Yep, we have decided to take a look at Franz Kafka's The Metamorphosis. It's not a very long story, but a lot happens in it, and it's fairly dense. So,
There we go. Controls are
yeah,
being funky.
yeah. So, admittedly, I haven't really had much exposure to Kafka outside of this story. I hadn't ever really thought to read it. I was passingly familiar with its existence, but until it popped up in my district's new textbook, I'd never really familiarized myself with it. And after we read an excerpt in class, I thought, why don't we read the rest of it just to see what happens? And it seemed like it'd be worth discussing.
Yep, and
Well,
she came home to me and told me about said experience, and I grabbed a collection of Kafka's works for relatively cheap off of Amazon and read it for myself a few days later.
you
And
didn't check Project Gutenberg? I think it was free on there.
I did not think to do that, no.
Always look for old books on Gutenberg first. Many of them are in the public domain, so you don't have to break the bank getting educated.
To be fair, I spent all of 99 cents.
Okay, Macklemore.
I do not know how to feel about that response.
It's not in your head? I'm gonna pop some tags.
I know the song, yes. But no, it did not immediately pop into my head.
So yeah, admittedly, I don't know very much about Hollow Knight. You suggested this one as a good connection to it once we'd both been familiarized with the story, but can you explain why Hollow Knight seemed an appropriate pairing for the Metamorphosis?
Because all of the characters are bugs. That is literally it. I know very little about the game other than it is a Metroidvania. It is relatively difficult to some degree, and all of the characters are bugs.
Okay, a little bit different because only one character ends up as a bug in the Metamorphosis, but yeah, suddenly transitioning to a game where a bug is having a very difficult time of life, that seems pretty on the mark. But rather than start by talking about the story itself, kind of thought it might be a little bit better to talk about the author and specifically his own personal adjective. Is there supposed to be sound coming through?
Very, very quiet ambient noise. You may not be able
Okay.
to hear it over your own talking.
Okay. All right. Just making sure we didn't have a issue.
Nope.
But yeah. So if you are passively familiar with literature at all, you've probably heard at least once the term Kafkaesque.
I've heard it. I couldn't tell you what it means. I understand it vaguely as through context more than anything else.
All right. What is your understanding of it?
Weird, kind of depressing, and kind of alienating in a way. Like I said, I don't have a clear definition of it.
Okay. And that's actually why I wanted to start with what you thought of it before I went into the definition, because I've heard it used in many different ways, so I did a little bit of digging to kind of see what the general consensus is, and it's actually fairly debated because it kind of depends on how you interpret what you read of Kafka's work as to what specifically it means. Because obviously, just going through the etymology of it, esque means like related to, so it's just
Right.
related to Kafka. So it's okay. Is it about the isolation that you can sense from his works? Is it about the weirdness, or etc., etc., etc.? What I've actually ended up finding was a little bit more specific than that.
All right.
Marked by a senseless, disorienting, often menacing complexity. So you are alone up against odds that you don't understand, and the world doesn't care about you. It's kind of a little Lovecraftian without the monsters and racism, if that makes sense.
No, yeah, that's a good way to put it. It's so it's kind of like it's that same humanity is a meaningless speck in the void of a vast uncaring universe.
Kind of, but it's more personalized than just you're too small to matter. It's the systems that humanity has created are more important than the people themselves. Like, I haven't really read any of his other works, but when I was looking this up, the trial got mentioned a lot, which is essentially about someone who is dragged into trial, never told what he's accused of, essentially found guilty even because they're more concerned about finding someone that they can make guilty rather than the actual truth of the thing, because preserving the system is the point of the system. It's not to actually serve any purpose to the people.
That sounds familiar. Cough, cough, Harry Potter.
Well, maybe we can talk about that later if we actually decide to read the trial, because I haven't yet. So this is just what I've gleaned from quick summaries when people try to define Kafkaesque.
Right. No, I haven't read it either, so that was just my off the top of the cuff reaction.
But yeah, so I think a pretty common thread we can see through Kafka's work based on this definition is the protagonist finds themselves overwhelmed by a situation that they cannot begin to understand, and the world is too busy being the world to actually slow down and let anybody help them navigate it. You are on your own because everyone else is doing everything else.
That is definitely a situation I can kind of empathize with. Maybe not to the degree of Gregor Samsa, but
So I do want to kind of note the timing of the Metamorphosis publication. 1915.
that'll do it.
Yeah. There's a little thing that's just started up around this time that might start shaping people's perceptions as to how meaningful various aspects of life are. You know, maybe you've heard of it called the Great War or the First World War. And given where Kafka lived, which was under the Austro-Hungarian Empire, yeah, he'd probably be affected by some things. So the circumstances surrounding when something is written, as we've mentioned before, can be incredibly important to why the work exists. So Kafka didn't live very long, 1883 to 1924. So I believe so about 41.
I was about to say that's like about 40 years.
Yep. So yeah, didn't live very long and probably had a rough time of it due to coming of age or reaching like not quite middle age during a war, because he would have been about 30 when the war started, which as an early 30s something, yeah, you still don't know what the hell you're doing when you're 30s most of the time.
It's a whole lot of faking it and hoping other people don't notice.
Yep.
But then again, I don't think we really need to say that to people watching. Most of our audience, I would expect, is probably about in that same range, maybe a little younger, and let's be blunt, that's a feeling we all get.
Yep. And probably something to note is that Kafka was not really a well-known or successful author in his lifetime. The Metamorphosis is one of very few works that he actually had published, but nothing he wrote really received that much attention. Almost everything he wrote was published posthumously against his will, because he told a friend to burn everything he'd written, and his friend instead liked what he saw and published it. So there's kind of a debate there as to whether or not, that was the right thing to do, because on the one hand, we get to see things like The Trial and other works he'd written but didn't want published, but there's something about there should be an inherent respect for the wishes of the dying, so I don't know how I feel about that.
Hey, look, it's a creepy thing from the opening scene.
Oh, so it is. But yeah, he couldn't write it full time because he obviously wasn't very successful with it in his lifetime, had to keep a job when writing was basically what he did on the side, which might explain why so many of his works focus on like struggles in the workplace on top of all of the bizarreness happening to the main character. So, yeah, I don't get the impression from his writing that he was a very happy person. The world seems to mostly be a meaningless place. Things happen to people for no discernible reason, and there's not really much recourse that can be taken that can get them a happy ending. From what I've found and a little bit I've read about Kafka, I think only like one or two of his stories actually give the protagonist anything resembling a happy ending. The
We touched on it.
Metamorphosis is not one of them.
Yeah, yeah. Well, the protagonist doesn't get a happy ending. One could kind of say some of the other characters do, in a really twisted and sad way.
Yeah, which we can get to when we actually start discussing the plot and the elements thereof. I'm just kind of trying to get a background for like, here's the kind of person that would write something like this.
No, yeah, absolutely.
Again, there are many different schools of literary analysis. We're looking at one that kind of requires you to know a bit about the author and has some historical context at the moment. But structuralism is the approach that the text is the text is the text is all that matters. You don't really need to know who wrote it or anything about that. It's just what the author chose to put down on the page is all you need to know to dig into the work. I think that's a little bit reductive, but there is something to be said for just take the work by itself and see what you can come up with and then see how your perceptions changed based on adding other things in later. It's a fun thought exercise, at least.
We'll come back here later.
So, like, when you first read it, what was your impression of just knowing nothing else about it? If we didn't have Kafka's name on the top of it, what would your impression have been of the story that starts with, by the way, you're a bug now?
Well, my initial reaction would have been what? But after that, actually reading the story and such, sad.
Yeah. So did knowing it was Kafka going in change your expectations of what you were going to see?
It basically told me that things are not going to get better, and that's basically it. I have not read enough of Kafka to really have much expectation beyond his stuff does not tend to have a happy ending, as you said. So
yeah, and that's fair. Like, and I'm admittedly going to admit right here, I'm a bad English teacher in the sense that I am not as thoroughly well read as many others of my profession because I backdoored into English. My training was actually for history and social studies. I got my English certification later, so I am an English teacher without an English degree, so I didn't have the same required reading in my pedagogical training. I've read quite a few of the classics just as a point of I should do some catch-up work, and I hear these are good anyway, just on my own. But yeah, I'm not sure if I would have been more exposed to the greater oeuvre of Kafka at large if I had the same background as others in my field.
And honestly, it might have depended a lot more on where you went to school and who your professors were, and what was offered, than necessarily what your major was.
Yeah, though I will say that, like, with my history major, there wasn't a whole lot of, okay, now read this fiction novel by this author. It was a lot more of read this textbook that talks about the historiography of the Cold War and how different perspectives shape it.
Right,
So,
no, definitely.
Yeah. Which honestly helps quite a bit with regard to literary analysis, because when you keep in mind the voice of who is telling the story and why they would choose to word something in a certain way, it very much pairs with discerning authorial intent and refuting the death of the author. So, I mean, it's not like it's completely irrelevant, and it's helping here with the whole Austro-Hungarian background in Prague, actually. So, what would be now the Czech Republic during World War I and the years surrounding it does definitely help explain why someone would write things as surreal and just
depressing.
Bleak. Yeah, bleak is what I was going for, as Kafka is known for. So I think you don't necessarily have to be an expert on Kafka going in. All it does was, as you said, temper your expectations to know that, like, Gregor's situation is not going to get any better as the story goes on. It is, in fact, going to deteriorate, and that's kind of the point. The world in Kafka's eyes is cruel and uncaring, but not intentionally so. It's mostly through what people have prioritized as important, and what is important is not the ailing protagonist. If you are suffering alone. No one is going to help you out. They're going to, in fact, take advantage of the situation in any way they can. So, yeah, we have a nice, cute little game to serve as our backdrop for this incredibly depressing analysis of a sad story.
I
Can you
mean,
think of anything else we can really add?
it's not a completely unfitting thing. I don't know the story of Hollow Knight. I am playing this partially blind. I played enough of the game to learn the controls and get a gauge of the difficulty. I basically have done this first intro area around Dirtmouth. So the rest of the game is going to be blind to me. But what I have seen is that we are in the crumbling edifices of what appears to have once been a grand society. And now all that is left is a handful of people scrounging among the ruins for whatever treasure they can find, a few old residents struggling to get by with whatever means they can, treasure seekers going through the wreckage of this lost society for anything they can get out of it, and hostile creatures defending their homeland against intrusion with little way to communicate with the protagonist as to why they're doing this other than attack you. I'm not
I think
sure
you picked
this is
a
unfitting.
really good one. Yeah, this is eerily fitting for how the story of the Metamorphosis actually goes, which we can get into next time, because I think we're out of introduction.
Yep, that pretty much sums it up.
Right, until next time, stay buggy.
So yeah,